Hey, I'm Nancy Cavey, National ERISA and Individual Disability Attorney. Welcome to Winning Isn't Easy. Before we get started, I've got to give you a legal disclaimer. This podcast is not legal advice, but nothing will ever prevent me from giving you an easy-to-understand overview of the disability insurance world, the games the disability carriers play, and what you need to know to get the disability benefits you deserve. So off we go. Do you have multiple sclerosis? If so, today's podcast is for you. But if you don't have multiple sclerosis, you can still learn lessons from this podcast about how disability carriers handle claims, how they view claims, and some of the games that they play. I'm going to talk about three things today: multiple sclerosis and common reasons why disability carriers deny these claims, how disability carriers evaluate multiple sclerosis claims, and the steps to winning your multiple sclerosis disability claim, and the use of the gold standard test. Let's take a break. We'll be back in a minute.
Have you been robbed of your peace of mind from your disability insurance carrier? You owe it to yourself to get a copy of Robbed of Your Peace of Mind, which provides you with everything you need to know about the long-term disability claim process. Request your free copy of the book at caveylaw.com today.
Welcome back to Winning Isn't Easy. You ready to get started? Let's first talk about multiple sclerosis and the common reasons why disability carriers will deny a multiple sclerosis claim. But before we get there, I want to set the stage and talk about what the disease is and its symptoms are, because I find that many disability carriers don't understand the disease or its symptoms. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a progressive disease of the central nervous system. It disrupts the flow of information from your brain and between the brain and your body. It damages fatty myelin sheaths surrounding the axons of the brain and the spinal cord. Axons are like tiny electrical cables that connect each nerve cell to the next nerve cell. The scarring and the demyelinization caused by MS prevents these axons from conducting the electrical signals that enable the nerve cells to communicate. Now, there are 4 different types of MS, and each of these different types of MS have different symptoms. I find that disability carriers tend to lump MS into just one big category, and they don't differentiate the symptoms that are unique to each form of MS. The first form is relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, called RRMS. There's primary progressive MS. There's secondary progressive MS, and there's progressive relapsing MS. Now, this is even more complicated because the symptoms will differ from person to person, even if they have the same type of MS. So if you have RMRMS, your symptoms may be different from those of the next person. That is a unique characteristic of MS. There's also another unique characteristic of MS that disability carriers don't get. MS can be both episodic and progressive. So you might have periods in which it seems as if things are getting better. And of course, during those periods of time, disability carriers are inclined to deny claims. But unfortunately, the disease will generally progress over time, and the symptoms get both more severe and more frequent. I think it's really important in your medical records, in your forms that you're submitting to the disability carrier, that you are documenting accurately and honestly the nature of your symptoms, the severity of the symptoms, the frequency of the symptoms, and how those symptoms impact your ability to function. It's not just the symptoms that make you disabled, it's the impact the symptoms have on your functioning. Now, MS can cause many symptoms. There can be loss of balance, dizziness, a lack of coordination, fatigue, pain, tremors, muscle stiffness, spasm, numbness, visual disorders, difficulty concentrating, and even depression. So now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the common reasons why disability carriers will deny an MS disability claim. The thing that you need to understand is that there are 3 primary arguments that disability carriers will make. The first is that your condition is pre-existing. The The second is that you can't objectively demonstrate your disability. And thirdly, they'll argue that even though you can establish that you have the MS diagnosis and that your condition isn't pre-existing, you can't establish that your disability really keeps you from working. So let's take each of these apart. Now, the first argument that your MS is pre-existing really is a limited defense. What do I mean by that? If you are newly employed by your employer and they offer you disability coverage and you accept it and then claim that you are disabled, the disability carrier is going to do what's called a pre-existing condition or look-back analysis. The policy probably says that if you became disabled within a certain period of time after you were covered, your disability is going to be considered pre-existing, and they don't have to pay disability benefits. Now, you will need the experience of an ERISA disability attorney to help you grapple with the confusing requirements of picking the right day to stop work and to claim the disability benefits you're entitled to if you are newly insured under a disability insurance policy, because we can't fix you picking the wrong date. And sometimes we can't fix it at all because you are required, the nature of your medical condition requires ongoing medical treatment. You might have a Social Security disability claim, but you may not have a disability claim based on the application of the pre-existing condition clause. Now, more often than not, disability carriers are denying a claim on the basis that there is no objective basis for the diagnosis. A lot of the complaints of MS are subjective in nature. And carriers will say, look, there's no objective basis for the diagnosis because it's based on your complaints, which are subjective. And there's no objective physical examination. Now, we know that there is no exact test for MS, and the diagnosis is often made by eliminating other disease. This means producing objective evidence can be difficult, but certainly there are tests that I'll talk about that are the gold standards for a diagnosis of MS. And the diagnosis of MS can be difficult, particularly in the early stages of the disease process. And so it's really important that in your medical records, your doctor is eliminating other potential causes for your symptoms and the difficulty with your functionality. Many carriers will get hung up on the fact that there might not be a diagnosis or a differential diagnosis that explains the symptoms, and that can be the reason for a denial. But the courts are not so sympathetic about that defense. They really are not interested in tagging you with a diagnosis, as opposed to seeing that there is an objective basis for your symptoms and an objective basis for how those symptoms impact your ability to function. That's why it's really important that you have an MS specialist who is evaluating and treating you, and that they're doing a great job in documenting your symptoms and your functionality. Now, the third reason why claims get denied is the carrier might concede that you have MS, but they take the position that there's no objective basis for your inability to perform your own or any occupation. Basically, disability carriers are looking for any kind of defense that they have, and they will tie the lack of objective basis of restrictions and limitations to their analysis of your occupation, particularly if you're in the own occupation stage. It's important that you get out your disability policy and read the definition of disability and your own occupation so that you understand what are the material and substantial duties of your own occupation that you have to prove that you're unable to do. It's not uncommon that there are different definitions of occupation. It could be your occupation is performed by your employer. Your occupation is performed in the national economy. Your occupation is performed by, according to the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. So you've got to figure out what the definition of occupation is, because we ultimately want to establish what those material and substantial duties are. We want to establish why it is you can't do those, and then we need to come up with an objective basis for why you can't do the material and substantial duties of your occupation. It might be that you need a functional capacity evaluation. Maybe you need a neuropsychological evaluation. Maybe you need a CPET exam to address the cognitive exhaustion issues. Each case is fact dependent upon the nature of your MS, the stage that it's at, the symptoms that you are experiencing, and then tying all that together to establish that you meet the definition of disability and definition of occupation, predicated, of course, upon objective evidence of the diagnosis and objective basis of your restrictions and limitations. Now, that's also crucial because carriers don't recognize, as I said, the relapsing, remitting nature of the disease or the progressive nature of the disease, and they tend to cherry pick at different stages of the claim. So you obviously need to be conversant with your disease, its symptoms, and its functionality. You need to have a thorough understanding of your disability policy, and you have to have a physician who's willing to play ball with you and the disability carrier to overcome these kinds of defenses. Let's take a quick break before we head into our next segment.